What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back with another Detroit Lions coaching video. We've done some live streams over the last couple of days, including on Bleacher Report, so always check that out. If you follow me on Bleacher Report, you follow the Lions, you'll see it Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 6 p.m. Eastern Time. We've talked a lot about coaches. I've done some breakdowns over there that I haven't done over here, so if you're always looking for more content, especially right now for coaches, that's a spot to take a look. But over the last couple of days, man, we've done some live streams over the news about the coaching staff, and typically it's been about guys leaving, but now it's about the guys joining the Lions. And yesterday we talked about our defensive line coach, and I think that's something that we'll revisit when the offseason happens. But today I wanted to dive even more into this defensive coordinator search. I do feel like the defensive coordinator search could absolutely be out of house. It wouldn't surprise me at all. We're set to have our interview with Larry Foote, which we touched on in yesterday's live stream. So if you did not see that, the second half of the live stream was all about Larry Foote, and I think it was a really good segment. It wasn't a video, but you could find it. It was a great segment, I think, that we did in there, and it was like half the live stream. But today I want to talk about two other out-of-house options that have been, their names have been constantly brought up and tied with the Detroit Lions. And I don't want to make this super long because neither of these guys have been hired. And if I make this 45 minutes and then neither of them get hired, it's going to be crazy. It's like, okay, why did we do all that? But it's definitely a foundation that we can build today. And then, of course, we can always revisit this if one of these guys do get hired as the Lions' next defensive coordinator. So with that being said, let's waste no time with the guy that's been probably discussed the most. That to me has to be Dennis Allen, the former head coach of the New Orleans Saints. Dennis Allen has a crazy path. A lot of these things that I didn't know before kind of researching the background of Dennis Allen to getting to the spot where he was. I mean, how early he started as a head coach back with the Raiders in 2012 to 2014. It was actually a pretty surprising hire at the time. He had only had 1 year of experience as a defensive coordinator, and that was with the Denver Broncos in 2011. As you can see the stats on the top. Keep in mind, it's one season, but the top list here is going to be before he got there, and the bottom is going to be after he was there for one season. So the improvements that we can just see the stat line across the board. I like to do those things, especially if it's only one season. So it was a surprise hire at the time, and even the background of working with a guy like Sean Payton, how that came about, the interest that Sean Payton had to bring him in as an assistant defensive line coach before ultimately making him the secondary coach of that team. They didn't need a secondary coach at the time, so they brought him in as an assistant defensive line coach because that's how impressed they were from afar. Dennis Allen was a very fast rising name, got an early opportunity with the Raiders. Didn't go that well, but probably not all his fault. I mean, it was a really tough situation. New owner taking over at the time. And in terms of draft capital, the situation that it was pretty messy. Even Dennis Allen has looked back on that like, yeah, I'd like to be a head coach again, which ultimately, no, he was with the New Orleans Saints. Obviously, in terms of the situation, wanted it to be a better situation than what that was. And that's super understandable looking back. I think they said the first year he got there, they had a third-round pick. Like, that was their first pick in the draft. Craziness, especially when a team's looking for a new head coach. And he's had 1 year of experience as a coordinator. Just look at it from the statistics, and we'll kind of focus on that today. If you look at it from the numbers, it's really hard to argue that Dennis Allen is not a great defensive mind. I think it's pretty clear-cut when you look at these numbers. So what I put here in the middle, of course, is that Raiders stint, 2012 to 2014. See some of the improvements within there as kind of the surprising hire just over the seasons that he was there. Defensively speaking, run defense is the key that I really focus on when I look at this. In terms of the pass defense, it got a little bit better, probably a little bit better across the board. And then also situationally, and I think this is a key. Even Ben Johnson has talked about this, the new Bears head coach, that situationally he's constantly one of the top red zone defenses and a top third down defense. He gave respect to him after having faced the Saints defense, and there's a couple of those pillars with Dennis Allen that you do see. But I think there was a great article written, it was put on like NFL.com years ago, about the turnaround of the New Orleans Saints that took happen. It really started in 2018, 2019, became one of the best defenses, and it was really the control that I think they allowed Dennis Allen to have at that time, who they were going to be schematically. Spagnuolo was there, then he was let go, and then they ultimately moved off Ryan in 2015, and that's when we saw Dennis Allen take over as their defensive coordinator. And from then on, from everything that we hear, it was really them allowing him to have that kind of influence. And he has talked about how important it is to have the certain players that fit what we want to do schematically, so they wouldn't have to go out and sign like the biggest names in free agency, but they would just fit the way and the style that they wanted to play. And we've seen that ever since, and I think it really speaks to some of the continuity you see when you look at the roster of the Saints. Like, we always know the pillars that are going to be on the Saints when you face that team. For a while, it was Marshawn Lattimore. Then, of course, it's Cameron Jordan. Of course, it's DeMario Davis. And they've had that year after year after year. They were led by veterans, and it was that continuity that they had built and they had leaned on as the consistency of their foundation defensively and who they wanted to be. You don't know what kind of personnel packages we want to lean into. He's like, let's get more to the traditional four down linemen. Then we start to see the emergence of the 4-2-5 and the 4-3. And remember, with all of this, like, this is a guy that, of course, Aaron Glenn worked under, Dan Campbell worked with. Both guys have reportedly spoken highly of Dennis Allen, and it sounds like Dennis Allen's a great guy to get along with. It took over, like, how are we actually building this thing going forward? Ultimately, it turned into a team that by 2019 was essentially led by their defense, and I think the numbers clearly say that. I mean, in 2018 was the first time we really saw the run defense take off, second in yards per carry, first in expected points added. The pass defense was still a little bit of a step behind, but then you get to 2019, and that's kind of when everything took off, and then from there on, it just kind of rolled in terms of consistency, specifically when you start with the pass defense. I think you see it in some of the personnel that they have brought in, right? Paulson and Debo, the success that he had there. I would say Taylor, but it wasn't great this past season. But of course, Marshawn Lattimore, Von Bell, Malcolm Jenkins, and then you get to the new guys at safety, and you go to Tyrann Mathieu recently, and it's that consistency of knowing exactly who they want to be stylistically. And the interesting thing about with the Lions is there's actually a lot of things stylistically that are similar to what the Lions do, which makes a ton of sense because Aaron Glenn's from there. So I think overall, when I look at Dennis Allen, one of the things that stands out to me is I believe that for a team that's kind of looking for, we have to kind of build this thing from the ground up. Our defense is in a messy spot. This needs kind of an overhaul. Whether that's personnel or not, we got to get this thing back on track. I think Dennis Allen is an outstanding candidate for anybody looking for that as their defensive coordinator, and it would make sense why a team like the Bears, who kind of fell off this past year, even with as much talent as they have, would look for something like that. The Lions have constantly been trending the right direction. It feels like they've already kind of built a foundation. Here's how we want to play stylistically, and now it's trying to pick up and kind of carry that tradition on and continue the momentum that they have built to this point. But I think any team that's looking for that probably should be interested in Dennis Allen because that's what he did with the New Orleans Saints, and he was there so long that he ultimately, as we know, took over the head coaching position. Surprised knowing how fast he rose in the past, and then ultimately what they got that defense to. And the consistency in terms of situationally, third down defense was usually top ranks. Red zone had a little bit of ups and downs, but consistently a top team on third down. Interception started to rise in terms of pass rating allowed, one of the best constantly. Now pressure percentages, blitz rates, those were typically on the lower side at most. It was more middle of the pack and how aggressive they would be blitzing wise. Couple pressure rates there between 2019, 2020, 2018, where it was much on the higher side. And when you watch New Orleans, it seems like they definitely lean more on kind of what that personnel is going to look like. So when the personnel was there, and it was Cam Jordan in his prime, and then you obviously brought in a guy like Marcus Davenport, and when they had Sheldon Rankins that came in, when they had those dudes on the defensive line, the pressures were there. Maybe they could even blitz less. And of course, in the back end, when they were able to kind of put together that group that fit what his outlook was of what that was going to be defensively, and he had the major say in that, and it was like, okay, laying it out to the personnel people, this is what's going to fit my defense. Him taking that initiative, I think, led to what we saw with the Saints for years, and he deserves a ton of credit for that because that was one of the worst defenses of all time until Dennis Allen kind of helped get that thing turned back around, and it's been consistent. It's been consistently one of the best pass defenses, and again, I think there's things that carry over, the gap and a half style up front, the 4 true down linemen that they typically would play up front, even as recently as last season, that carries over. Obviously, all the personnel overlappings. Alex Anzalone, Will Harris goes to the New Orleans Saints. A guy like David Onyemata, I liked him a lot when he was going to become available as a free agent. There's a lot of stylistic similarities because of the gap and a half style, because they're also one of the top man coverage teams in football. According to Pro Football Focus, through week 16 of the past 2 seasons, 6th most man coverage last year, 2nd most man coverage the year before. So there's a lot of stylistic similarities really outside of how often he blitzes defensively, how aggressive maybe he is defensively in that sense, and that's okay because it works for the defense and who they are. While the foundation remained very similar in a lot of ways, red zone defense, the coverage types used in the red zone, right, very similar. The combo coverage looks that we would play, the man coverage on third down, the cover one blitzing on third down, those things, while they carried over, there was also differences as well into what Dennis Allen was and how he wanted that defense to look versus how Aaron Glenn kind of had the Detroit Lions structured a little bit. So when I look at this, I don't think there's a good case to say that this isn't a fantastic defensive coach, and I think for most teams, it's like, yeah, this is probably going to make a lot of sense. And I think for the Lions, it would make sense because they're in a unique spot where there's a lot of what the Lions have now that I think would easily translate into what he does, right? When DeMario Davis got there, it changed everything as their inside linebacker. And Jack Campbell has changed a lot of things for us within this past year as our linebacker and what he's opened up for Alex, just like he did with the New Orleans Saints. I think there's a ton of similarities there. Safety run support. You think about Brian Branch. You think about Von Bell. You think about Tyrann Mathieu. A lot of similarities. Now, maybe Maybe some differences in coverage. There's still a lot of man coverage, but they will press up. They'll get physical. They're long. I think we got some different body types, but there's similarities there as well. And their ball hawks typically come from the safety position, just like us. So I think that there's a lot of things that are similar to why the Lions have success defensively. However, when you look at the personnel, I think this is where the downside is. And I'm not necessarily blaming the personnel on him, but understanding that there's two sides of the coin of typically when you look at the Saints, especially in recent years, maybe when things were a little bit worse, when their defensive line isn't at that same level, obviously things have taken a step back, because I don't know that from what I have seen so far that I feel like this is the most adaptable defensive coordinator, where it's like, what's wrong at the time? Let's get to this. Let's change this completely. He was adaptable in the sense of, here's how I'm going to put my defense together. And I think that's great. And it's not all his fault like that, hey, maybe you're missing your draft picks, or you don't have draft picks, or you don't have much cap space, and you're very limited in what you could do. That's not his fault. And I do believe that if Dennis Allen was the Lions DC in Detroit, he would be in a much better situation because we have a better general manager. We have a team that right now isn't in a salary cap dumpster fire where we can't sign anybody. But I think it also kind of speaks to he's built a defense to play a specific way, and that's the way that they play defensively. So when they have those pieces, they're fantastic, and we've seen that, and they're consistent, and guys play fast, and it's built by veterans that have understood the defense, and it also allows them to go sign guys in free agency and find that kind of success. Now, on the interior, they've had issues. Brian Brzee, they invested, haven't gotten the return on that investment. You know, you look at a guy like Shepard in the interior, that's a guy they've had to lean on. They have a guy like Sanders and Kalen Sanders in the interior. He's just been kind of average. Animata towards the end was a little bit of a step back, and as guys like Cam and Jordan have started to pull back, and they've tried to get like Chase Young and guys like that to step into that role, hasn't really happened. Peyton Turner didn't hit. He didn't pan out into that role. And while I think this definitely can be a concern, it can also absolutely work if you lean into, this is a style he's going to run, let him have control over the defense and kind of just get out of the way. And Dan Campbell may be looking for that. I don't think he necessarily needs to be, because he's done this before. Aaron Glenn wasn't a defensive coordinator. Now, in fairness, he did have to fire his offensive coach and take over play calling, so I guess it could be different this time around if his idea was to just lean on Lynn. But even if you look at it in the past, since Isaiah Foskey hit, maybe not, but they're trying to find a body type to fit that style of a mold. And again, you kind of limit yourself, I think, when you're looking for mold types like Brian Brzee. He was a very clear, like, this guy can fit in that kind of mold. That's why he was connected to the Lions a lot. But if you're looking for a mold, I think it leads to more often missing draft picks. However, you can also get high-level play out of mid-level payment. For example, what you have when Ellis and Davis are healthy together, and you have the right two skill sets alongside each other. But then, say this past year, you have Willie Gay, who really towards the end of the season kind of pulls back on that role. You're going a different direction. You don't get what you expected at that spot. Now things automatically take a really big drop off. Happens to everybody. It happened to us this past year. But I think it's a little bit more concerning that it can happen like that just because if things don't connect through the draft pick. In the back end, they've got a lot of good things. Ante Taylor, not a great pass season specifically, but Paulson Debo fits perfectly for this defense. He's aggressive, he's long, he's perfect for the defense. The cover 3, the single high coverage, the cover 1, the man coverage that they play, it works perfectly for them. And then they utilize a lot of 2 high man coverage looks as well, kind of like the Lions would do against Minnesota, for example. And that allows them to be aggressive, be physical at the line, funnel things into their safeties. Kool-Aid McKinstry, it can kind of limit the concern of just straight vertical speed when you have a scheme that fits to that. This is a guy that's going to build a team a certain way and a scheme a certain style, and it's going to work. When you have the right pieces, it's going to work. And the best benefit that he has with the Lions versus a lot of other teams is that if he came here, there would be a lot of things that would immediately translate. You'd have to make some tweaks, but it would translate. However, I think that the team that, my guess is, a team that gets a guy like Dennis Allen will be a team that's more so kind of trying to, we got to get this thing back off the ground. I think where the Lions are at situationally doesn't mean that it wouldn't work here, because I think that there's an easy case to say that this would work here because it works kind of everywhere for Dennis Allen as a defensive mind. And he's clearly a very smart defensive coordinator, and he's wanted to prove to himself, hey, I know what I'm doing, and I think he's clearly proven that. But at the same time, I think where the Lions are at, it doesn't make it necessary. Lost as often as they did, but yet they still maintain a very solid defense, which is tough to do because typically if something's going to fall off, it might be your side of the ball. And it really never happened up until this past season, where again, you kind of had a setback from some of their top key players. And once that kind of, I think, settled in, as well as consistently not having much of a deep offense whatsoever, it led to the losses as a head coach, which is very understandable. But we had seen that, like, this guy will blitz, that can crock into the top 10. Like, you go back to the 2019 season when they had the top defensive football. I think he's unique. I think he would fit the line schematically, but I don't know that this is the spot that he would ultimately go for and go after to kind of settle in. I don't think I'd have any doubts that it's probably going to work. And the good thing about all the carryover and all the similarities is that I think it would work here. However, I think the Lions have been a little bit maybe more flexible in terms of it's a little bit more, just like we heard from Brad Holmes, the player that we draft, defensively we're going to make it work, right? We're not out to find this specific position or this specific like lingo. He's got to be the Mac backer for the Lions defense. That's what we need in the draft. Would it be nice to have another guy that could play outside linebacker, can rush the passer, play a little bit in between, drop in coverage? Like, yeah, I think that'd be a great fit for the Lions. But that's not really who they've been, right? They've kind of been just more so, what are we? Okay, let's adapt this season to what that's going to look like. And I think they do have a foundation they're building forward with here, and I just don't know that that's exactly the fit the Lions would be after, but I think he'd be a terrific defensive coach if it was. The next person I want to talk about a little bit is a guy that name I'm probably pronouncing wrong, but it's spelled sort of like this, Jim Leonhard. It just has an H, that's why it throws me off, who was last season working with the Denver Broncos, whose defense absolutely took off this past year as their defensive backs coach / defensive pass game coordinator under Vance Joseph. And there's really not really an overlap here outside of when Vance Joseph took over with Miami, Dan Campbell was out of the building. So I guess that's the overlap, but there's not really one. Now, there was some personnel overlap, like for example, Quan Alexander. He was doing well with Denver. The Lions ultimately picked him up during the season. So there was stylistically some things that of course translated here, but there was also a shift to getting to what Vance Joseph was and who he was going to be as a defensive coordinator to help get that thing turned around. And shout out to Sean Payton because he was patient with him after a pretty awful start. And ultimately it's gotten to that point where it's working really well with Denver. But I think when you look at this past season and the rise that they made, their new defensive backs coach / defensive pass game coordinator for one of the best pass defenses plus run defenses, I don't know how much credit we should give him for that, in the NFL this past season. But also the fact that this is a guy that also does have defensive coordinator experience, albeit at the collegiate level with the Wisconsin Badgers, but he ultimately took over as the interim head coach in his final season as Paul was let go. He stepped in as the interim head coach. What he has, and you look at it from a production perspective, is excellent production year in and year out with Wisconsin. I mean, it's across the board. Every year that he was there, they were fantastic defensively in terms of completion percentage allowed. Typically, all the time was one of the best in the country. Touchdowns per game, interceptions per game. Rush defense was constantly really, really good, which is something I always start, especially at the college level. It's tough to find consistency in stopping the run. His run defense was always really good, and now there's a potential that he jumps in back to the defensive coordinator level at the NFL level. And I think the first thing that caught my eye here was having done the stats through the season, how much man coverage they had played, depending on what website you would look at. Now, I think the difference is I think Denver played more match coverage and they had more soft coverage principles than what the Lions would typically. Like the Lions for certain game plans may have that, but Denver would kind of lean into that more. And I don't know if the website was tracking match coverage as just man coverage, but they may have been, which is why the numbers were so inflated. The point is they were playing it at the same rate as the Detroit Lions they had them. According to PFF, through week 16, they had them at the 8th highest man rate. So that immediately caught my eye, plus the fact that aggressively speaking, they blitzed a lot, right? 7th highest blitz rate, 2nd in pressure rate. We saw it this past season. Had a 3-4 defense going back to Wisconsin that would jump into the nickel, could get into some 2-4-5 looks, and that carried over really well to I think what Denver was looking to do, because stylistically they do kind of the same thing, right? They had their 2 outside linebackers, Nick Bonito, Cooper this past season, who absolutely took off, and it kind of fits stylistically to what both sides had done, and I think it translated incredibly well to what Denver was looking to do. So stylistically, I think there's real differences here in how both teams decide to approach it in the back end. They play much more match coverage from what I had seen, even going back to college. I think the big positive that you look at on what's the big positive for this defensive coordinator candidate, from what I can tell, is that they are one of the most sound units, I think, stylistically in the back end. Dennis Allen's teams, they know exactly what they are. And that's awesome. It allows them to play fast, and that's why they're so consistent all the time. The flip side here with Jim Leonhard is smaller sample size, not at the NFL level, but their defensive backrooms are constantly super sound. Even in college, the inverted coverage look, the coverage disguises that they would implement, but then even the way that they played out those coverages throughout their match coverage, how they would play it out, the communication, the spacing and man coverage for press, or here's a stack, or here's a bunch, and how they would pass those things off. That is such a sound unit, and of course, that's what he was mainly responsible for. And if you look at it this past season and the personnel they had, yes, they had Pat Surtain. This is one of those teams that ran a ton of cover one, early in the season specifically. They played a ton of cover one. They were right up there with the Lions. You're playing as much cover one defense as the Detroit Lions early in this season. Now, again, different principles. They play more cover 4, kind of keep things in front of us, cover 3 matching. They play a little bit more of the softer coverage principles, but at the same time, they had the cover 1 in their bag, and they would blitz out of it, and they were super aggressive out of it, and they played it at a very high rate, similarly to what the Lions have done this past season. Now, I think part of that's personnel. If you look at the personnel that they had, Riley Moss, McMillian, the safety position, They had a lot of turnover there, which is even more impressive. From the second level and to the third level, there was a ton of turnover within kind of this defense. I mean, you look at it from the linebacker position, they have a guy like Barton taking a ton of snaps after losing a guy like Josie Jewell. Remember, they didn't have much financial flexibility whatsoever. At the safety position, they move off the veteran Justin Simmons. Jones has to step in at safety, and he has one of his best seasons of his career, and that's what they did this season. I thought they got excellent play out of what they had, and while I think a lot of it looks similar to what it looked like back in Wisconsin, so it makes me feel like they knew that, okay, stylistically, this is just going to work. Out of a versatile 3-4 front that when they got to the nickel packages, they could bump into these kind of overlooks here in a 2-4-5. So now all of a sudden you can play the 9 technique and you can kind of move around your interior defensive linemen, similar to what we do. And that probably went down like that in the interview. Like, this is my vision. This is how I do things, how you do things. These things mesh together really well. What I think is a big positive for them is clearly, based on the personnel they did have, they did a great job of getting their best out of it, right? This isn't full of expensive players. They have 1 first-round pick on the defense this past season, and that was Pat Surtain, who was their best player defensively. The defensive front, again, isn't loaded across the board, but they got good play out of it within how they handled it stylistically, and that allowed guys for like Nick Bonito to have success as a stand-up outside backer, rush, drop back into coverage. Allen, guys in the front and the interior that, again, were fantastic, but they played really well together. Those guys had a really strong season. It led to a top-tier run defense. They just played really sound as a defense as a whole this past season. Good example here, a third and medium. They bump out into their Tampa 2 after showing man coverage. It finds success, forced a check down, and they're short of the first. They did a great job of really dialing back on the explosive plays that they allowed. They were one of the top teams in terms of allowing explosive plays defensively this past season, which again, I think some of that's to that 2-deep type of coverage and also some of their coverage 3 looks. But with that being said, when you play that high of a rate of cover 1, that also speaks to you're getting some pressure and you're able to throw off some timing, which they were capable of doing, and they were passing things off really well, switching off coverage really well. They were super sound back there, and their safeties would give really good support. And you could just see it by the way that they would play, and because of that, they really limited explosives as well, cranking up the blitz rate, which isn't typically a thing that we would see at that high of a rate for Vance Joseph, and he cranked it all the way up this past season in terms of aggressiveness, which really speaks to the speed at which they were playing, the comfortability that they were playing. And then you get up front, and again, it's some different front looks than what we've seen because you get kind of the 3-4 base. You would see the tight fronts. You'd also see their ability to kind of jump into some of their 4-3 looks out of a 3-4 defense personnel-wise. They could get into their 4-3 over fronts based on kind of the personnel flexibility that they did have. A team that runs a ton of stunts up front, which I thought created a lot of pressure, but they did it within a way that didn't constantly cook them up front from what I had seen. Like, they allowed pretty much middle of the pack of just over 18 yards, about 18 and a half yards per game to a quarterback rushing, which was better than us, but yet they had a lot of stunts up front. There was a lot of games that happened up front, and it was super fluid, and it wasn't always as much of like the linebackers getting involved from what I had seen, kind of like it was with Larry Foote, but it was more of the defensive lineman's fluidity in terms of filling lanes, but also still being in a stunt, have a lot of success up front. A lot of times you can contain better out of stunts if you handle it properly. If you don't, then you can turn it into an absolute disaster, and I thought they handled that pretty well. They were able to, again, not have top defensive players outside of Surtain and make it work, and they played as a unit. The cohesiveness was awesome, and I think, again, a lot of there's differences stylistically. We don't play a ton of match coverage. We played it like one time against Green Bay. We didn't do it a ton outside of that. We played some palms against Indy, but we didn't play a ton of that. That was more so of kind of like, this is Denver style. So while a single high, there were still differences to the way that we played it. We did play a lot of cover 1, and we had a lot of success, and we did blitz a lot, so those two things would definitely carry over. The man coverage usage for sure. Stylistically, I think there's some differences at times in terms of like support we need because we have different athletes at corner. We have different players at corner. I think that in the back end, we actually have more talent than what they have in the back end personally, just based on Kirby Joseph and if Brian Branch and what we have at corner versus what they have, depending on who comes back, of course. But as of right now, I think we have more talent in the back ends. Like, this one of the cleaner coverage reps that I had seen, right? Going into quarters coverage, one safety drops down on Travis Kelce, and then the other safety seamlessly rolls over the top to take the slot receiver breaking across the field. I thought that was just covered so seamlessly and well. There's differences in how they did things, but the idea of playing man coverage like Dan spoke on and bringing pressure, that's something that he was a part of. And he did that back in Wisconsin, and there was consistent success. And probably the biggest thing that I love from a production standpoint is the consistency to stop the run. That's massive. And they were very fluid and very versatile in the way that they did that up front. They put a lot on their nose tackle that I think would translate well, playing him into zero technique like they did in some of their fronts. Sometimes he would shade, but a lot of times zero techniques ask him to be able to get over gaps or, post-snap create a slant. That way you didn't know necessarily which gap he was primarily responsible for, but they had the athleticism at nose tackle to open that up, and I think with DJ Reader and especially Aleem, Lions would have some of that flexibility here. So I think there's characteristics of what the Lions have that could translate. I don't think it's the exact same as what we do, but I do think that when you look at kind of the overall foundation and the success they had adapting to the talent that they had, to me, he absolutely should be in consideration. And again, at linebacker, like Barton had his best season this year. Bernard had a great season. The guy hadn't really even played since 2021. You know, Jonah Ellis was a rookie this year. Benito had a fantastic season, most pressures of his career. And this was all without guys like Alex Singleton and then Josie Jewell. Singleton got hurt. Josie Jewell was one of the vets that constantly had a lot of tackles. So they lost a lot of production and quickly kind of brought it back to life. So it didn't take a process to put this thing really together. And I think that speaks a lot. I'm a fan of Jim Leonhard from what I had seen so far. He seemed to handle it really well when he had to take over as interim head coach for Wisconsin, just in terms of the pressers and the way that he was kind of poised within that. I don't know the Lions are looking at this because I think there are some differences stylistically. He was willing to adapt, and Dan Campbell's looking for, you know, there can be some real uniqueness there. I think that he should definitely be considered. Defenses, specifically in the back end, are very sound. Now, I love the idea of going after guys that have the linebacker backgrounds. You know, we talked about Larry Foote because I think for us, one big key this offseason is handling the run specifically. Like, we have to get back to being a better run defensive team. I think we got to put ourselves in better spots, and I think that for the back end, we have a lot of guys that we don't necessarily maybe need to have a guru as our defensive coordinator on the secondary to make that happen, because Deshea Townsend's still here as of now, and the players that we just have in the back end. But that being said, I think up front, we do need that. So it's just something to kind of keep an eye on. But I'm going to leave it there. Those are two guys to keep an eye on. We can always talk about more, and I probably will. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you, Pride, for watching, and I'm out.